There are three basic questions we're going to ask about every type of function. What does its graph look like? What does its inverse look like, if any? Is it invertible? Is it one-to-one? And what is its range and domain? So, let's think about these questions for linear functions. To determine the implicit domain of a function, we ask, what numbers make sense to plug in for the variable? And by make sense, we mean if we plug these numbers in for the variable, we can do all of the arithmetic involved in evaluating the function. Now, for a linear function, there are only two things that can happen involving the variable. We can add and subtract, and we can multiply and divide by real numbers that are not zero. If we have 0 times the variable, there's actually no variable there. And we have to have a variable in a linear function. And of course, we can't divide by 0 because that's just not a thing. Now, adding and subtracting, multiplying and dividing by non-zero numbers, these are defined for all real numbers. And so the domain of a linear function is all real numbers. In notation, we write the symbol r, or because computers really love interval notation, we'll sometimes express all real numbers in interval notation as the interval from -infinity to infinity. So that's the domain. The domain of a linear function is always all real numbers. To find the range, we have two possible approaches we can take. One is to consider just what are the possible outputs of the operations involved. So just kind of the same way we did with the domain. This is typically the more difficult method. Or we can consider the domain of the inverse function, if there is one. Since all linear functions are one-to-one, we're going to choose option 2. We're going to consider the inverse. The inverse of a linear function is itself linear. And so the domain of the inverse is also all real numbers. This tells us that the domain and range of any linear function is all real numbers. And that's the fact that we have here. If f is a linear function, its domain is all real numbers, and its range is all real numbers.